My name is Stephanie Frisinger, and I have decided to participate in this project because I am very passionate about women's rights and work to um, bring about equality for women. And I am happy to help the next generation of feminists in any way that I can.
Okay. So my first question is, how do you define feminism and what does it mean to you?
So, I believe that feminism is the belief in and advocacy of the political, economic, and social equality of the sexes. So I think that in the definition of feminism, then comes the definition of a feminist. So a person that is practicing feminism. So I define a feminist as an individual who is actively fighting against female oppression and inequality. So I like to think about this. This analogy was first adopted when talking about being anti-racist, but I think that it really makes sense with being anti-sexist as well. But if you think about like a moving sidewalk, like the ones that you see at an airport,
Mhm.
if you just stand still on this moving sidewalk, you're still moving towards a direction, right? Because it's a moving sidewalk. So the moving sidewalk is the gender status quo of female oppression and male privilege in this country. That's like the structure that this country was built on. And so that's the way that the moving sidewalk is always going to move. So if you just stand still, you're going to be moving with the side of oppression. It's only if you actively fight against that moving sidewalk, when you're actively walking against it, that you can actually make some ground against the way that that moving sidewalk is going.
Yeah,
So I think that the active piece of that definition is very important.
I like your definition. Like, definitely, like, we all have to be constantly moving and constantly adapting to these changes and, making these efforts, which is really important.
Yeah.
My next question is, what are some misconceptions about the feminist movement?
So I think that between the second and third wave of feminism, right, we think about feminism in waves. The first wave of feminism was back when women won us the right to vote about 100 years ago. And then the second wave of feminism happened in the 1960s and 1970s when like Roe v. Wade was decided and the birth control pill was first released and approved by the FDA, like that kind of stuff that was all happening then. And then there was kind of this hiatus, and the third wave of feminism kind of started in the 1990s. But in between those two waves, feminism kind of fell out of favor. The label of being a feminist became sort of a dirty word. And I think that it was largely a group of or a generation of women that were kind of rebelling against the feminism of their mothers. But in that era, we came up with these like common misconceptions of the feminist movement. And so I think that there's a couple that are pretty common. And that's that feminists believe that women are better than men. Feminists hate men.
Yeah.
Feminists are angry. Feminists are not feminine. All feminists are Democrats. Feminists are not religious. Feminists do not support stay-at-home moms. Feminists can only be women, and that feminists don't believe in marriage.
Yeah, I think there's like a definite stigma around it. I learned this in world history, like that religion is like a major role in why people think like they're rebellious and they're bad people when they're really not, and they're just trying to, have that equality. Um, I think one key part was about the contraceptives that I learned in world history, where they like implemented it to like control the women, and like they thought it was okay, but like it really wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah, there was like if you read back, there's some pretty bad stuff that happened around the turn of the century where like women were institutionalized into like psychiatric institutions, and they were forcibly sterilized so they couldn't have children. um that was, yeah, it's pretty messed up if you look at like the history of like female contraceptives and that type of stuff. There's been, I mean, the birth control pill, like the FDA approving the birth control pill in the 1960s was like a huge turning point for women's equality because it gave us control over our bodies in a way that we never had control before.
So it kind of brought like a good and a bad in a way.
Yeah. Mhm.
So my next question is, why is it important for everyone to be aware of this issue, and how does it affect other other genders and generations?
Yeah, so it's important for everyone to be aware of this issue because in this country, we claim liberty and justice for all, but we can't claim this if there are people in this country that still remain oppressed. And whether those people are oppressed because of their sex and gender or because of their race or religion, oppression does not equate liberty and justice, right? And women have proved themselves time and time again that we are just as good as men. And it's time for the sociological structure to reflect that fact.
Yeah. And like for me, like the most important part about this is like I don't want to like live in a future where like I had to worry about these things anymore. Because like to be honest, like it's really sad. Like I even see it in the kids at school and it kind of makes me like heart it hurts my heart in a way. And like
Yeah.
I just want to create like a really supportive community, and it's hard to do that when everybody like tries to go against you in a way. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that there does. I think that, like, with that, I think there has to be some type of unity that happens between not just women. Like, you don't have to be a woman to be a feminist. Like, men can be feminists too if they believe in actively fighting against female oppression. But I think there has to be this like unity, this driving force, like kind of how we saw this past summer with everything that happened with the George Floyd protests. um, I don't know if you know, but I'm from Colorado and I'm living currently in Colorado. And we were one of the states that passed a really comprehensive bill after all of that happened that ended qualified immunity and like did a lot of stuff in reaction to all of that, all the protests that happened. And so it's like really powerful to have unity
Yeah.
in making real change.
Yeah. I think the hardest part is just like having everybody be open-minded to your opinions and stuff like that, because like for me, like I try to stand up at school, but there's a lot of people who like there's this toxic masculinity like surrounding it, and it like really just hurts me in a way because I'm just trying to like voice my opinion and try to stand up for myself and like these girls at school who are facing these struggles as well.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that you are voicing your concerns and your beliefs because um, people are always going to try to shoot you down. Like,
Yeah.
it's, that's just the way that the world works. But if you create this tough shell now, if you kind of have this thick skin where you're able to not take things personally, then that's going to make you a stronger advocate
Yeah.
in the long run.
So from Miss D, I heard you wrote a paper on, how do you pronounce it?
Modified.
Sorry, yeah, feminism. So what exactly is that, and how do you think we can resolve this issue?
Yeah, so I think it's probably better to start with the definition of a commodification or a commodity. So when something gets commodified, that's when something is in its original form, it's taken from that original form, and it's changed into a form of something that can make money.
Mm-hmm.
So the purpose of like commodifying something is to make money off of it, right? So when you're commodifying feminism, that's when you're taking this, like the idea of the feminist movement, and you're kind of warping it in a way where you can now sell this idea and you can make money off of this idea. So following the second wave of feminism, like I talked about, that was in the 1960s and 1970s, feminism began to be commodified. So it kind of started shifting into this world where like, oh, like consumers are going to buy this. And so we can sell this. So the original goals and ideals behind feminism were watered down so that feminism was palatable to everyone. and as such should be consumed by everyone. And so dilution allowed for appeal to the widest audience and then therefore the greatest amount of consumption. So I think like a really interesting example of this, especially for my generation, but I definitely think that it bled into your generation as well, was the rise of the girl power movement. So like think about all of the things that you see, like the shirts and the shoes and the Barbies and the dolls and like everything that you see that has this like girl power, like girls are great, you know, girls are smart, like whatever that is. You know, that's like commodified feminism. That is, oh, well, we're gonna put this like feminism thing on a shirt and then we're gonna make money off of it. And often like the places that are making the money are places that, you know, if you think about who's selling this, like if Walmart sells a shirt that has girl power on it, the owners of Walmart, like the CEOs and everything, they donate a bunch of money to the Trump administration. So it's like the money that's going towards Walmart is not even going towards like the feminist movement in any way. It's just they know that they can make money off of it, so they're going to sell it. And so yeah, so that kind of started taking over right around like the late 80s, early 90s, kind of when I was born. I was born in 1993. And so I definitely grew up in that like commodified feminism era. And I think that your generation also grew up in that, at least when you were younger. I think that things are changing and things have been changing since 2016. I think that that was a big marker in a new feminist wave. But I think that like the consequences of that are that they're like this feminism kind of gets watered down. And so you don't really know what you're consuming, right? Like you're consuming this like watered down version of feminism. And then we also have this rise of post-feminist rhetoric that was occurring around the same time, like in the 1980s is when it started under the Reagan administration. So post-feminism is this like false idea that feminism and the women's movement has come and gone, that it's over now and that we're equal and that everything is good with gender, like we're good. And so there was all this post-feminist rhetoric, like all this post-feminist words that were being spewed in the media and everything that were saying like, you know, yeah, we're done. Like, you know, the women's movement has been won. Like you guys have won equality. And so you don't need to fight anymore. And so that was super problematic because like that was what I was raised with, was kind of all of that happening in the background. And I think that there's a bunch of ways to combat the commodified feminism and the post-feminist rhetoric. And I proposed a couple in my paper. So first, I think that it's important to recognize the divisions in the previous feminist movements and come up with creative solutions that are dynamic instead of one size fits all. Mm-hmm. So the biggest thing here is to recognize intersectionality. So intersectionality is the idea that like, it's not just that I am a woman, right? There's other issues that are at play here. So like, if, for example, think of Black women, right? Black women, not only are they a woman, and so they have like gender inequality that's like a big hindrance towards their success, but they also have racism as a big hindrance to their success as well. And that's kind of the intersectionality piece of it. So we have to be really mindful of how other things come into the feminist movement, because it's not just about being a woman. There's other things that matter. And so we need to be really creative in our solutions. And I think that one of the ways to have the best types of solutions is to be giving those women a voice, the women that have really previously been left out of a lot of previous feminist movements. Those should be the women that are taking center stage in a current feminist movement, to create solutions that work for all women instead of just a certain group of women. And then I think that we do need to grapple with difficult questions like who gets to be a feminist. And I think a strong definition of a feminist will go a long way towards answering that question, like the definition that I provided you at the beginning of the interview, which was the actively fighting against gender oppression. And then I think finally, we need to build a stronger and broader feminist coalition. So we need more people. And I think that this can be accomplished in two ways. I think first with education reform to introduce feminism and the feminist movement earlier into the lives of America's youth. And so this could look like we need to reform sex education for sure. That is a big problem in a lot of states because states get to come up with their own sex education, and you can imagine that more conservative states in like the South are teaching like abstinence only, or they're teaching sex education that is really hostile towards the LGBT community. Or they're, you know what I mean? Like it's like anti-women and anti-diversity in every way. So that's one way. And then I think that you could build it into curriculum for all classes, right? You could start thinking about this stuff in kindergarten or first grade when you're reading certain texts you're reading certain picture books to your students, and you're kind of discussing these things early, right? It can be something that happens earlier. And then by the time you get into high school, you could do a cool project in your math class about the pay gap. Or you could discuss, kind of how you were talking about, you were discussing the women's movement in your history classes. Like you could discuss that a little bit more in history, but you could also talk about it in a biology class where you're like looking at the difference between like biological sexes and like kind of getting rid of those myths that come along with it. And then the second way that we can build a broader feminist coalition is with amplification of the Me Too movement. So amplifying women's voices and amplifying that we believe women that come out to speak up against gender oppression in any way that it's happening, whether it's unequal pay or it's sexual harassment, it's sexual assault. Like we believe when women come forward about this stuff, and we're going to amplify their voices by saying that we believe these women.
Yeah. I think that having like a big part, like what you said with the education, I like that idea, and like introducing it to like a younger audience so that they grow up thinking that these things are not normal and we should address them, which is like an important part. And I feel like that's why a lot of people don't really understand this topic, is because it's like in a way they normalize like not like normalize, like I don't know how to say it, but
Yeah, no, you're thinking about like a big sociological concept right now. It's gender socialization. It's the way that we like socialize our kids into thinking about gender, into thinking about like, oh, well, like this is what girls do. This is what boys do. Girls wear pink, boys wear blue. Like, it's those like that's like gender socialization from a young age, and kind of changing that socialization to be more inclusive of different like ideas that are not like from like 70 years ago is important.
Okay, so my next question is kind of similar to this one. So, in what ways can we amplify our voices and make change in our community, especially at my age, being young and yeah.
Yeah, so I think that so we'll start with the definition of amplification. So that means to increase the volume of sound. So when one person tells a story, it's only as loud as that one person. But when 1,000 people tell that one story, it becomes amplified and more powerful. So amplifying female voices and voices of all kinds it's easier now than ever before because of social media. And I think that that's like the biggest tool that this generation, like my generation and your generation, have that other generations, other feminist waves did not have, is like we have this tool where we can amplify like immediately. If you have a following, you can amplify to all of your followers, right? And if they amplify, then it amplifies to their followers. So I think that the biggest piece is just talking about stuff, right? Like when you read something in the news or when you see something online, I think it's important to always do independent research. That's just being a critical thinker, right? You're not going to believe everything that you read on the internet. We know, like, our generation especially knows how dangerous that is, but the baby boomer generation seems to not have a clue why that's dangerous. Which is funny because, again, social media is our tool. Social media is what we can use. But so always do your research, but then talk about it, right? Talk about it with your friends, talk about it with your family, and talk about it on social media, right? If you see something that causes you to have like a visceral adverse reaction because of something that's just really horrible, share your thoughts on that and see if anybody else wants to respond to those and have like a dialogue with you. I think that that's important. Yeah. So social media, it's a big one. And then just, yeah, talking about things, right? If you talk about things and it becomes part of the dialogue, it means that like all these boys that you're talking about with the toxic masculinity, like if they're forced to talk about it all the time because you won't let them not talk about it, then they're going to get better, if that makes sense, right? Or they're at least gonna like be forced to see different perspectives eventually.
Okay, so my last question is, what do you think is why do you think it's more challenging to achieve equality, equity, and inclusion in other countries such as Poland with their restrictions on women's health, and especially Middle Eastern countries where women need permission from men, especially due to religion?
Yeah. So I think that this goes to the overall power structure. And we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but just that um, the way that the power structure was made in this country, in the United States, and in every country. I mean, like, let's be honest, no country was made with a female power structure.
Yeah.
Every country was made with a male, and usually, like at least in the United States, like a white male power structure, right? And think about if you were a white man and you had all of this privilege because you were a white man, would you want to give that privilege up?
No, like from their perspective, no.
Yeah. So it's like, when we have men at the top of the power structure, and then we're trying to like get women equality in here, it's really hard to do when the men are at the top of the power structure because the men are not going to dismantle this power structure that has given them so much privilege and that gives them so much privilege, because it means that they have to give up some of their privilege in order to allow the space to open up to women, right? So I think that that's the biggest piece, like in the United States, in any country, is this power structure. And like you see in like other countries, like in the Middle East, where there's like virtually no representation by women, right? But don't think that like our like Western first world countries are doing much better either, because like in the United States right now, we have less than 25% representation by women in Congress. So that means that men still have 75% of the political power in this country. And think about like the CEOs of like the big companies in America.
Oh man.
Less than 5% of CEOs in this country at the top companies in the United States are women. So it's this power structure, right? That's the way that we're going to solve anything, is by with more women in positions of power. And so, in the Middle East, there's like I said, there's virtually no representation at the top. But even I just looked up before our meeting, I looked up the like top ranked country in the world for women's rights. And right now it's Sweden, according to US News. And I read that Sweden has actually 47% representation in parliament by women. So that's like pretty close to being equal representation. But Sweden, which is the highest ranked women's rights country in the world, has yet to elect a female prime minister ever. So that's like the equivalent of a president, right? So, even in like the highest ranked country in the world for women's rights, like we still haven't broken through that glass ceiling of that highest level place for us to be. And so I think that that's like that's the biggest challenge to achieving equality, equity, and inclusion, both in the United States and other countries. And that's like obviously more difficult with the less representation by women that you have in a given country. But even in countries, like I was saying, like the United States, which actually doesn't rank that great in countries for women's rights. But if you look at like countries like the United States or like Sweden and Denmark, like these places in Scandinavia that have like really good women's rights, there's still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah. It's funny because like the other day I was thinking like we can go to space, we can do all that, but we can't achieve equality in a way. And it just really like made me like think about these things and how we're moving as like the world like together.
Yeah. And like we've made progress. Like we can't deny the progress that has been made, but the progress is definitely happening at a slower rate than I think that as women that we want to see, right? Because it's absurd that we live in a world where I can be working the same job as a man and I can be being paid 70 cents to every dollar that they're
Yeah,
paid.
I heard like that still continues to say like 82 cents per dollar. And I was just like, if you really add that up, that's a lot of money.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of crazy. And you know, that's just yeah. So I think that there is a lot of work to be done, but it does, I will say that it gives me a lot of hope that we have women like you that are rising up in this next generation because, you know, if I'm going to be completely honest, like I didn't think about these issues until really I was in like, I mean, I would like, I experienced gender discrimination at a very young age. Like, I'm sure that you've probably experienced gender discrimination from a very young age as well. And it sounds like you're very smart. And I think that that also um, plays into it a little bit. Like, men just don't believe that women are smart sometimes. Um, but I didn't really start thinking about these things until I was in college. And so it's really inspiring for me to know that like your generation is thinking about these things now, right? And I think that, you know, part of that's just, again, like that culture that we grew up in and how this culture has really shifted. And I think that the big shift happened in 2016, right? When Donald Trump got elected. And then 2017 was that spark of the Me Too movement, because that was when the New York Times released their investigation over the sexual assault allegations by Harvey Weinstein. Um, so like I think that that was like a big shift in the feminist movement, but like that shift happened for me when I was like 23 or 24. And this like that shift happened for you like at, you know, when you were still in middle school. And so like it's really cool that you guys are growing up and like thinking about these things now, because like I just, you know, we just need more women. We just need more women to be part of our coalition. We need men too, but I think like the biggest group needs to be women, and we just need to be fighting for what we deserve.
Yeah, I think like with social media, like you said earlier, it was like a major part in like learning more about this and being more aware about it.